Thank you for joining us for this session, Reimagining Pretrial Justice, Telling Minnesota's Story. We're going to get started by introducing ourselves on the panel, and then we'll move into the program. So I'll hand it off to Adoniyah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Adoniyah. I represent Minnesota Freedom Fund. First of all, I'd like to say I'm honored to be here. I am a bail specialist for Minnesota Freedom Fund. I've been on the team for approximately a little over a year now. It's about 4 of us that are on the team, and I love my team members. They're awesome. I just wanted to, that's all. I'll pass it to Brianna.
Thanks, Adoniyah. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Hall. I use she, her pronouns. I am a criminal defense attorney and legal fellow at the Legal Rights Center in Minneapolis. And my focus for my fellowship is on pretrial justice and cash bail reform, which is what brings me to the space today. I'm really excited to talk with you all, and I'll hand it off to Brie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brie, and I am a doctoral candidate in sociology at the University of Minnesota, and I'm also a research assistant at MNJRC on the Reimagining Bail Project.
Hi, all. I am Marci Exsted. I use she, her, hers, and I'm a current research associate at the Urban League Twin Cities for the Center for Social Justice, and I also am a research assistant for this project.
Hello, I'm Victoria Piehowski. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Minnesota in the Department of Sociology. I'm also the research manager at MNJRC working on the Reimagining Bail Project. So thank you again, everyone, for coming today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Great. So to start us off, we're going to hear a couple of stories. I think when we talk about criminal legal reform, centering the experiences of people who have been system involved or system adjacent is really critical. So we're lucky enough to have 2 folks here today who are generously sharing their personal experiences and their professional observations on bail and how Minnesotans are experiencing it. So I'll hand it off to Brie to start us off with that.
Thanks, Anna. So as Anna said, I'm going to start today by talking about my personal story and my own experience with bail in Minnesota. In 2020, I was assaulted by my now ex-boyfriend, and he was arrested and booked in jail. And during that time following the assault, I was physically hurt. I had bruises on my back and arms. But I was also extremely vulnerable. I was in a very vulnerable mental and emotional place. And so when I think about it in hindsight, I imagine that kind of vulnerability is part of why when there's a domestic assault in Minnesota, a protective order goes into effect, and they're referred to as DANCOs, domestic abuse no contact orders. And DANCOs prohibit contact with the victim. So no face-to-face contact, no electronic contact, and no indirect contact through like a third party. In my situation, the DANCO went into effect when my ex was arrested. Despite that, I was the first phone call that he made when he was in jail. And he called me over and over again in jail, despite the DANCO. And in the calls of in the recordings of these calls, he repeatedly apologizes and asks me to bail him out. And I repeatedly tell him that I don't want him to contact me and that I'm not going to bail him out. When I stopped answering his calls, I told the jail that my number hadn't been blocked yet from his account. And so then he had his family members calling me. He had other people in jail calling me, and he then had a bail agent call and text me. So under DANCOs, the restriction of contact through a third party extends to anyone. So that includes bail agents. In the state that I was in at that time, the intensity and the pressure of the calls and texts eventually just got too overwhelming for me. And I was experiencing pretty bad anxiety. I fell behind on my work responsibilities. I wasn't eating or sleeping. And I had a lot of shame that prevented me from confiding in people who may have been able to help me. So to get that harassment to stop, I agreed to go with my ex's mom to meet the bail bondsman and to co-sign for his bail. My ex's mother said that her son was going to make the monthly bail payments and that she was going to pay the 10% down payment. She just wanted me to be the co-signer on the contract because she didn't have good credit and she thought that she would be denied. Before that, I had never bailed anybody out before. I'd never worked with a bail bondsman, and I'd never co-signed a contract for a bail bond. The bondsman asked me if I had a job, if I had a car, or if I had a house. And my word was pretty much taken at face value. I didn't have to provide proof of my answers. He told me very little about the contract that I was signing. And I, at that time, didn't know what kinds of questions to ask. So I signed the contract and I gave the bondsman the money that my ex's mom had given to me. And the whole process lasted like 10 to 12 minutes. My ex made the monthly bail payments for 6 months after he was released on bail. During that time, however, he continued to stalk and harass me. And when his harassment continued to the point that I was getting fearful of my safety, I sought a no contact order, and then he immediately stopped making the monthly bail payments. Around the time of his sentencing for the assault, I received a letter in the mail requesting my appearance in conciliation court. I'd received a monetary judgment against me because he had not been making his monthly bail payments, and they were seeking money for that bail. I'd worked out a lower monthly plan with the bail agency, and I started making the payments on my ex's bail just as he was going to prison for assaulting me. He was also eventually charged and convicted with an additional felony for violating the DANCO. Today, I am financially responsible for his bail payments. I make $80 payments every month, and I won't have his bail paid off until next summer. This was my personal experience with bail, and I'm going to hand it off to Adoniyah, who's going to talk about his experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Brianna. And being a bail specialist, I see these types of things kind of play out and all over Minnesota, you know, people being harmed by how the bail process is currently operating. I'm sorry that happened to you, Brianna. That doesn't really make any sense to me, how they can even come after you like that. My experiences, my personal experiences with bail is that I had never paid bail in particular. However, I was given a $750,000 bail, one in which I could never afford, of course. And it begs the question is, after you had given me that assessment and learned how much I made, how much I was worth, what my level of education, so on and so forth was, you still decided to give me a $750,000 bail, knowing I couldn't pay that. So of course I was going to sit there. And according to the particulars of any case, sometimes you would sit there for a very, very long time without any real assistance, you know. So which was my experience. I had no real assistance. So I had a public defender who, from my estimation, absolutely did nothing for me. You know, I'm not going into the particulars of the case, but just to keep the focus on the bail, just plays out across the board. You know, individuals are given these high bails, even misdemeanors. I just had an individual who could not afford $25, homeless individual, had a court date that was kind of maybe extended out 3 weeks later, but they wouldn't release him. They held him for $25. This would be Hennepin County, of course. So I'm seeing these things played out all over the place. People are really struggling out here, and they put this responsibility on the individual to pay this bail, and knowing that they can't. So you have to ask, what is the sense of it? What is the real sense of it? So, and you want to, MFF personally, we want to just bail everyone out, but we know that that's not feasible. We know we have to be responsible in what we do. So we put together a great bail team. We put together a great post-release team so that we are able to monitor individuals or ensure that individuals can make their court dates and so on and so forth. I just want to one more thing. I just want to say this. We were in the county, Ramsey County, to pay a warrant for an individual. And we had all of the information from all of the various websites that we go to for the county that he was being held in, from MCRO to MCES. And we saw that he had a bail of $200 cash, no conditions. When we got to the county and he wanted to turn himself in, and once he got back there, they resolved to tell us that the bail was $15,000 because because their information wasn't correct. We proceeded to show him the information, which is online on MCES. They have access to it right there in front of them. He refused us and decided that he wanted us to insist that we pay the $15,000. So we had to, of course, score it, make telephone calls to get this rectified, and we did. But these are the things that is happening when you're dealing with this situation with bail. The counties are not communicating with one another. Individuals are being given these bails that they have no way or no clue of how to pay for. So they're losing jobs and housing, and so on. But these things, the most pressing thing about the bail is that we have a right to it in this state. And by us having a right to the bail in this state, it should be a much better process put in place to ensure that everybody is given that opportunity to post a bail that is, or just completely get rid of it. And I'm more leaning towards let us get rid of it. So I'm very proud to be a part of the bail team. I hope that we are one day able to close our doors, because that will mean that we were successful in playing a part and bringing this cash bail system to its knees. And with that being said, I would like to pass it to Ms. Marci or Anna, excuse me, Ms. Anna.
Thank you, Adoniyah. And thank you for sharing part of your story and part of what you see at Minnesota Freedom Fund. And thanks also to Brie for being willing to speak about such a difficult experience, and one that you're kind of still living with. I'm gonna share my screen now, and I want to transition into a little bit of background on bail and what exactly it is, to kind of level set for us and the conversation that's coming up next about research from MNJRC. So a pretty basic question: what is bail? Bail is just the amount of money that an accused person must pay in order to be released from jail before trial. This is what we call a condition of release. So in order to be released, the person must meet the condition, and the condition here is paying a sum of money to the court. As Adoniyah mentioned, in Minnesota, we have a constitutional right to bail. And this means that a judge cannot refuse to set bail in a case. Every person who is arrested, charged with a crime and held in jail has a constitutional right to have a bail amount set in their case. And because bail is a condition of release, what this really means is that every person has the right to pretrial release in Minnesota, as long as they can meet the conditions of their release, including any potential bail amount that's set. The Minnesota Supreme Court has called this an absolute right to bail in all cases. So when somebody asks like why a judge released someone on bail or didn't hold them, it's because in Minnesota, judges do not have that option. They are constitutionally required to set bail. And the Minnesota Supreme Court has also said that the purpose of this part of the Constitution is to limit the power of the courts and to protect the rights of the accused, not the other way around. So why do we have this constitutional right? Why is it so important that all people have the opportunity to obtain pretrial release? This quote from a US Supreme Court case is sort of part of what you'll hear from a lot of bail reform advocates. It's used again and again. It's something to return to. Unless the right to bail before trial is preserved, the presumption of innocence secured only after centuries of struggle would lose its meaning. The Supreme Court said this in 1951, and it is the guiding principle that really led states like Minnesota when they were passing their constitutions to include a right to bail. If you are held in jail pretrial, the presumption of innocence is, it just doesn't really exist. So in Minnesota, what do we know about who is in our jails? This is a graph from the Vera Institute of Justice that shows that the number of people held in jails in Minnesota has been steadily increasing for about 50 years, which you can see from the top red line. So as of 2015, there were 6,600 or so people held in Minnesota jails on any given day, not total throughout the year. Pretrial detention is the black line you can see is also been steadily rising, and it tracks the rise of the total jail population almost exactly. So what you're seeing is that the reason our jail population has been rising so dramatically in Minnesota is in large part because the pretrial population has been rising so steadily. So about 4,000 people on any given day are being held in Minnesota jails, and they have not yet had trial for the charge that they are in jail for. So that's about 60 to 65% of people held in Minnesota jails. That's unconvicted people who are presumed innocent. We do not know yet the demographic breakdown of the pretrial population specifically in Minnesota, but we do know what our jails look like demographically. So you'll see on the left what our state population looks like racially, and on the right what our jail population looks like. So while in our state, white people are about 83% of the population, they're only 44%, less than half of the jail population, while Black, Latinx, and Native people find themselves overrepresented in jails. So, the red section of the pie chart is Black people, about 6% in the state, but 15% in jails. For Native folks, it's 1% and 7%. And for Latinx folks, it's about 5% and 7%. So we're seeing massive overrepresentation of people of color in our jails. And there's really no reason to think that that wouldn't also be true for the pretrial population. We have also seen over the last 50 years or so a massive increase in the number of women being held in jails in Minnesota, about an 800% increase. And this is important for many reasons, but one is that women are often primary caretakers for their children. And we know that on any given day in Minnesota, there are around 10,000 children under the age of 18 who have a parent incarcerated in a county jail. So when somebody's in jail, it's not just affecting them, it's affecting everyone connected with them, including children. And then this graph from Vera Institute for Justice shows something that I think is really important to keep in mind, especially for those of us based in the Twin Cities. that this is not just a problem in urban centers. Pretrial detention is really an issue across the state. As you can see in the graph, the red line at the top shows that the most rural areas are the ones that have the highest rates of pretrial detention right now, followed by small and mid-sized and suburban. So you're really getting, the urban counties are the lowest rate. Obviously that doesn't necessarily come out to raw numbers. The metro area is much more populated, but we're seeing this issue continue to arise all across our state. So I want to quickly talk about how someone posts bail in Minnesota. And there are 3 main ways. The first is on the left. A person can pay money bail. They or a family member can do it for them. You heard in Brie's story that well, actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to get to that in a second. So you can pay it all at once. You can pay it, you have to pay the full amount in cash, usually, depending on the county. As Adoniyah mentioned, the counties do not coordinate well, so it's really different from place to place. And then that money sits with the court. It's held by the court, and it's returned at the conclusion of the case. Although there are some instances in which fees are taken out of a bail amount before it's returned to someone. You can also pay bail with a bond. So this is what Brie spoke about. This is, she signed a contract with a bail bond agency. They posted what's called a bond to the court, which was not money. It's just a promise to the court that the bail bond company will pay the bail should the defendant not return to court for future hearings. And the 10% fee that's paid never gets returned. And then the third option, not all across our state, but in 6 counties right now, is Minnesota Freedom Fund. Their Minnesota Freedom Fund pays the full amount of bail for a defendant. There are no strings attached. There are no fees. There are no requirements to be involved in services. However, Minnesota Freedom Fund does offer supportive services to individuals that they bail out, including reminders to get to court, connections with social services, and rides to court. And then I just wanted to briefly touch on this. The next section we're going to move into, the folks from MNJRC are going to talk about some of the harms that they've heard about from individuals who've paid bail. But I wanted to talk quickly about the legal harms of pretrial detention and cash bail. If someone is detained pretrial, they are more likely to be convicted. And that's in comparison to other similarly situated defendants. So other people who are charged with the same crimes, who have similar backgrounds, similar criminal histories. And there's a couple of reasons why that might be the case. One is that it's much harder to help your attorney develop a good defense when you're in jail. You have a difficult time connecting them to your family members. You have a difficult time tracking down people who might be witnesses in your defense. It becomes much more difficult to assist your attorney. It's also true that, when you're in jail, it's much harder to do things that would help mitigate a sentence or, any sort of penalty. People who are released from jail pre-trial can attend drug and alcohol treatment. They can pursue their education. They can maintain their jobs. These are all things that prosecutors and judges look for, and they can't be shown to those people when a person is stuck in jail. But one of the biggest reasons that someone is more likely to be convicted if they're detained pretrial is because they are much more likely to plead guilty. They're in a worse bargaining position. Most people will do anything really to get back to their friends and family. And often for lower level offenses, the sentence is time served, maybe. So there's a strong incentive to plead guilty to get released from jail, because otherwise, if you don't plead guilty, you'll be sitting there longer than you would have been if you were convicted. But of course, there are, significant consequences to having a criminal record. And so there's the immediacy of needing to get out of jail in that moment. And there's the long-term consequences that come with a criminal conviction history. People detained pretrial are also more likely to get jail or prison time if convicted. And to end, they're much more likely to be arrested moving forward. And that really flies in the face of one of the rationales of that bail is that people, it's a public safety issue, and people need to be held pre-trial to protect the safety of the community. Folks who are held pre-trial for any amount of time become significantly more likely to reoffend in the future. And that's in large part because you lose your job, you lose your housing, you maybe lose custody of your children, you lose your connections to community. All of that happens when you're being held pre-trial. And that can send people, force people to make choices that they otherwise wouldn't have made. And I did just want to also highlight here, there are really significant immigration consequences to pretrial detention. There are significant immigration consequences to just being arrested, but the longer someone is held, the more likely they are to get on the radar of ICE. And if they were to plead guilty to a low-level crime in order to be released from jail, having any criminal convictions is also can severely affect your immigration status. So with that said, I'm going to pass it off to the folks at MNJRC to talk a little bit about their research and the folks that they've been speaking with who have experienced this system firsthand.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Anna. Sorry about my voice. So I'm Victoria, and I want to talk real briefly about what our project at MNJRC is doing. So we simply want to understand how bail is operating in Hennepin County, but not just from a legal dimension. We have a pretty intentional focus on the impact of bail on individuals and families and how that's connected. So as we started this project, we interviewed a number of system actors such as judges and public defense attorneys, prosecutors, even research staff for Hennepin County to help us understand kind of from their perspective how bail was working. But the heart of our project is interviewing community members who paid either for themselves or someone else, or who have remained incarcerated because they couldn't pay bail. Today, we are going to focus on those community member perspectives to give you an idea of the sort of lived dimensions of what paying bail does. I want to mention very briefly that we are using names when we quote folks today, but these are all pseudonyms to protect the people we've spoken to, their identity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marci, who is going to share our data today.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm going to share my screen here, and while I'm doing that, I just want to reiterate exactly what Victoria said, where we are using pseudonyms for people that we spoke with in order to protect their privacy, but their stories are very real, and we're planning to speak to even more people as we continue on. So in the discussions that we've had with folks so far, we've actually seen a really clear thematic story developing already. And that really consists of a consistent pattern of people's experiences, from starting with kind of that initial panic, like has already been mentioned, of wanting themselves or their loved one out of jail and away from its harms. And then there's also the way that the system itself feels like it's inherently predatory, preying on people in crisis in order to make money. And then finally, there are the lasting impacts on the lives of those who have paid bail or had bail set for them. And that's kind of, like I said, the thematic story that we'll be talking about regarding the data that we've collected in our interviews already. And so we will detail these in terms of the experiences from those we've spoken with so far, but we won't be surprised if we see that the upcoming interviews also kind of display some of these similar themes because they're so strong. So to start with the coerciveness of jail and bail, as we spoke with system actors, we were told that the two primary purposes of bail were to ensure someone's attendance at subsequent court dates, and like was mentioned before, to increase public safety, or in the pursuit of public safety. A lot of the community members we spoke with did not share these perceptions for the purpose of bail. In fact, community members actually pointed out a different safety concern altogether, and that was really the need to protect themselves and their loved ones from the harsh and potentially dangerous conditions of jail. Community members who paid for loved ones had either been to jail themselves at one point or had loved ones who had and knew well the serious impacts of jail on someone's mental and physical health, or even, again, like was mentioned before, their ability to fight their legal case from the inside versus out. Importantly, many system actors we interviewed actually observed that bail pushed people to plead guilty just to get out of jail. And a number of system actors explicitly explain that being in jail is very, very coercive in terms of getting people to plead guilty specifically. One community member we spoke with, Brianna, remained in jail for the duration of her trial because neither her nor her family could afford her bail. As she explains, the honest truth is that jail is way worse than prison. People will be happy to get back to prison. I know I was when I went to jail. So the people that's in there, they're in jail. They're at risk safety being in there. It's a safety issue. Another community member, Mark, had a long history of criminal legal involvement and more recently paid bail for his partner. And when asked why he bailed out his partner, he described the way he feels that jail actually impacts people and their emotional and mental well-being. He said, "They treat you terribly. Their mission, I believe, is to make it the most awful experience ever so that you maybe won't want to go back. But treating people the way that they treat you doesn't. I don't think the outcome is, I don't ever want to go back. I think the outcome is, I'm not a good person. And I think that's really detrimental to one's soul. The reason I bail people out is I don't want them to feel that. I know that what it feels like, and I don't want them to feel that." Other community members that we interviewed were really driven by the knowledge of these mental health impacts to bail their loved ones out as quickly as possible. When we asked one community member, Gabrielle, how she made the decision to take on the risk of signing a bail bond contract to bail out her brother, this is what she said. He was just like her brother. He was like, "Get me out, I might kill myself." So I was like, I knew I had to do whatever it took. I could just hear it in his voice. I don't know when I'm going to be able to call you again and stuff like that. So I was like, I got to get him out of there. And as people deal with these deep emotional tolls in the pretrial space, including not only the holding itself and navigating bail, but the arrest, jail, navigating the courts or attempting to, they also have to deal with the literal cost of trying to pay that bail, or even just the attempt to do that. So speaking of trying to pay bail, we saw, like I mentioned, a real big pattern in folks feeling like bail is very predatory and really focuses on money. And because jail is so coercive, family, loved ones, and friends are pressed into making serious consequential decisions with little information and under significant duress. People held in pretrial are not treated as full humans, but instead kind of forced to find a way to pay for their freedom. And it really makes you wonder, like, what does that do to your trust in the system after having that experience? And so Rashid, a veteran of the US military, actually expressed exactly this during his interview. He and his experience deeply impacted his family's perception of the legal system, and he described them as disheartened and having no trust in the system. Rashid admitted that he stopped trusting police because of how he was treated and shared how he felt bail was unfairly set as well. Like, having the amount set, like $10,000, was very steep. And I feel like they almost they thought they could gouge that out of us. Rashid mentioned that his lawyer was ultimately able to negotiate his bail down so that his sister-in-law could afford to bail him out. And they were able to pay that once that was reduced by the judge. But the next person we spoke with, Jasmine, was not able to pay bail for her boyfriend at the time without going through a bonding company. She explains her experience. They don't explain things very well. It's like, I'm a firm believer in leaving out information is a part of lying. They tell you just enough and you're really just focused on like, okay, they'll get out tonight. Okay, they'll get out tonight. As in Jasmine's experience, people in pretrial are positioned as customers or consumers as though they have a choice. But this is a predatory market. This sense of urgency to get yourself or your loved one out of jail is used by bonding agents to get people to sign contracts with far-reaching consequences and done in short time frames, right? 10 to 15 minutes only, like Brie mentioned. Many companies will even immediately ask, do you have a house? Do you have a car? Or do you know someone who does, in order to secure collateral? And they might even know that someone you're trying to bail out has a warrant in another county, but will still secure a contract despite knowing that that person will be arrested again and just brought to jail somewhere else. This was Jasmine's experience. Her boyfriend, for example, had a hold in another county, and so the bail she posted didn't end up mattering. She said she suspected that the bail bonds agent knew this the entire time. Bail bond companies also frequently don't take low bond amounts or bonds for people they think can't pay. So it's really not about helping people get released from jail. Ashley's experience really highlights this issue of how bail bond companies can perpetuate harm. Like, they always set people's bails so high to where you can't pay it. To me, who has $200,000 just sitting around to bail someone out? No one. Some bail bondsmen don't even want to work with you, especially when you don't have a job and you're disabled. So yeah, that was a bad experience for me, being disabled, no job, and trying to get a bail bondsman to work with you. Oh no, it's not happening. You'll still be sitting there. As a result of her high bail, Ashley had to get help from her brother and her mother in order to meet the cost of bail. And she reported that this experience put a significant strain on her relationship with her brother and that they don't talk anymore. Cash bail has been consistently shown to have a long-term impact just like this, and across different dynamics of your life, not just relational dynamics, but also financial for those who encounter it. So in thinking about those long-term effects for paying bail for a loved one, because the person who is arrested often cannot make bail, family members are then put in the position of making bail payments. In our sample, women who had limited financial stability themselves were often forced to make huge, risky financial sacrifices at a moment's notice. Mary, who paid her bail for her daughter, who was arrested while experiencing a health crisis, explains the impact on her life. I had to go without. Yes, my car loan payment became due trying to help her out. I really fell behind because I thought she would pay me back. But she was in such short state so she couldn't even pay me back. And that's why I'm like, well, she has helped me in the past too. So that's why I didn't hesitate to try to help her if I had it. I helped her. But yeah, it was really bad. Of our interviews so far, the majority of people who paid bail were Black women who already support family members and their community. Because women who paid bail had a number of other responsibilities and care obligations in their communities, these financial blows set off a domino effect of financial consequences that well exceeded the criminal case, or even, the $78 or whatever the court fee currently is. So Jasmine, who we quoted earlier, also explained the long-term financial consequences of paying bail for her boyfriend. I was already playing catch up, so it was really set so it really set me far behind. I ended up being like 2 months behind on my mortgage. When I was only a month behind on my mortgage, they're already talking about foreclosure. I got 2 months behind on my car payments. When it comes up to 60 days, they want to repo your car. If I don't have a car, I can't work. So I might try to figure out a way to block my car in my driveway so it doesn't get repoed. And she laughed while she said that. Bail is not a single event, but something that continues to have an impact on loved ones and communities for a long time. Jasmine added that her son is actually graduating from high school this year and she can't afford to pay for his senior photos. Jasmine's boyfriend promised that he would pay her back, and she admitted that she figured it would all work out if he went to court, but she didn't really realize that there would be many more court dates to follow, and then she was tied to making sure he made it to court because otherwise she would be held responsible. Even though she wanted out of that relationship and is no longer in it at this time. It's somewhat common for women who had to pay bail to find themselves tied to a relationship that is at worst dangerous, like Brie's, experience, and then at best really an unwanted relationship like Jasmine's. From all this, it's easy to see how bail can really change someone's life, but it goes even deeper than that. In Lynette's interview, we can see the intergenerational impacts and effects that bail can have. But we know what the consequences to that is. And so for me, I'm struggling. And the fact that everything you put up for this bail, as a child, I also experienced where my mom put her house up for someone's bail and they didn't return to court, and she lost her house that we lived in for over 17 years. When you take money from yourself, you take the money from your children. And I think that's really important, especially after hearing all of these stories from people that we've spoken with, and certainly on that heavy of and important of a note to just take like an intentional pause here really quick. So I'll give us a beat. All right. And so from all our interviews so far, it comes really as no surprise that cash bail is incredibly coercive, and it's a predatory practice that often and frequently has long-term and long-lasting consequences for those who encounter it, whether they're just paying it or they have it placed for them as part of trying to get out of jail themselves. And as we end today, we want to really give our thanks to those who have shared their stories with us. And we want to be sure that their expertise from their lived experience is at the center of our work in this project. All right, and then I will hand it off.
I think we're back to me, Marci. Thank you so much for that. I have been eagerly awaiting the results of the conversations that MNJRC has been having with community members. And I think it's really powerful the way that those themes recur over and over again. There are things that we heard in Brie's story and things we heard from Adoniyah. I'm hesitant to say this because I'm about to talk about data, but we don't need data to know that this isn't working. People's stories are enough and should be enough. That being said, Victoria and I are going to talk a little bit to close us out about what we don't know and what we're doing to try to learn more. So as I mentioned, we don't have great statistics on the pretrial population in Minnesota. We don't know the racial breakdown, the gender breakdown. We don't have information about, the average number of days someone is held pretrial. So in order to answer those questions, a coalition of folks got together, led by Minnesota Freedom Fund, along with Minnesota Justice Research Center, the Legal Rights Center, ACLU, and students from St. Thomas Law School. And we got together with the goal of being able to tell a clearer story about what's happening in Minnesota in the pretrial space, because there is no comprehensive data. And so the scope of the problem is hard to get our heads around. The stories from individuals provide a look into the nuance and the real human impact, but a more comprehensive understanding is still lacking. So in that coalition, we have spent the last year submitting data requests to sheriff's offices, the Department of Corrections, for jail booking data. And we're currently working to extract and analyze that data, which includes things like the number of days a person spent in jail, their race, their age, with the hopes that we can start to understand how this is, how pretrial detention is impacting different communities in our state. And then the goal is to combine that data with another request that MNJRC is heading up that I'll let Victoria speak a little bit more about.
Yeah, so basically these are two pieces of the same puzzle, right? So jails can tell us some pieces and sheriff's offices can tell us some pieces of how bail is working and who's getting detained pre-trial, and the courts can tell us other important pieces. So we're currently drafting a request for the state court administrator's office, who holds the data for basically court practices across Minnesota. And broadly, we kind of have, we basically have two broad questions, right? Are there are there disparities or inequities in how bail and other pretrial conditions are being applied, right? So who's, what levels are bail being applied and to whom and to what communities? But also other pretrial conditions. So for example, electronic home monitoring is another condition that can be ordered at court, and it comes with its own list of consequences and effects. So we want to understand, how is this being applied in the courts? How is bail being ordered along with these other conditions? Then we kind of want to understand a little bit more how bail is working. So in terms of affecting later outcomes in the system. So the big question here that we have that I'll close out on is basically questioning if it does what we think what we all assume it does, right? What is the relationship between pretrial status and folks actually coming to court of bail? As I said as Marci, well, I guess I didn't say this, sorry. It's been coming up in our data that a lot of folks we interviewed are surprised that bail is supposed to secure people's attendance into court. And so that is something we want to understand more empirically. But we also want to understand if bail is undermining larger outcomes, right? So in Minnesota specifically, what is the relationship between pretrial status and case outcome, right? So we can really understand here to what extent bail is impacting people's case outcomes. So I want to close there. We have about 10 minutes left, and we'd like to spend this time to do a Q&A. So I guess I'll turn it over and.
Yeah, I think folks should feel free to unmute and ask a question or drop it in the chat. It looks like we have the first one, so I'll just read that out for the recording from Chad. I find the bail bonding industry to be extremely problematic by introducing a profit motive and allowing private enforcement. Has there been talk of outlawing that industry in Minnesota and adjusting the cash amounts to be affordable? I was a contract public defender in Wisconsin for several years, and bail bonding is illegal there, and the cash amounts set are comparatively affordable compared to Minnesota. It's one of few, if not the only way in which the state's criminal justice system is more progressive than Minnesota's. Incidentally, there have been proposals to legalize bonding in Wisconsin in recent years. Thanks for that question, Chad. I am from Wisconsin, and I empathize with you, and it is interesting to see the comparison between Minnesota and Wisconsin on that issue. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has thoughts about this. Otherwise, I'm happy to respond. So as far as I know, there hasn't been a discussion yet in any serious way about outlawing the bail bonding industry in Minnesota, but I do agree with you that it is a deeply problematic industry. And, I think when we talk about who's creating the profit incentive, I actually think it's the system that creates the profit incentive and the bail bonding industry that responds to that. And so in some ways, the bail bonding industry, like all for-profit industries, is really just stepping into a situation, a gap where they see and filling that gap. I think it's really important to acknowledge that for all of the destructiveness of the bail bond industry, it does provide a service to a lot of people in the state. And I would want to hear from our community members about whether what their feelings are about getting rid of the bail bond industry. I do think the prospect of lowering the bail amounts at the same time that we get rid of the bail bond industry is a great idea. And I think, at the end of the day, if we're talking about removing an incentive for the bail bond industry, the fastest way to do that is to get rid of cash bail. So I'm on Adoniyah's train here. If the bail bond industry can't make money off of cash bail, it simply won't exist. And so it may be a better use of our resources to focus on the incentive structure that the state is creating rather than the industry responding to that incentive structure. We had another question from Kelly. Are any of the researchers looking at the practices in each state and compiling that? And I think, Kelly, I think I'm going to interpret your question as referring to bail practices generally rather than the bail bond industry specifically. And the answer is yes. That's a big part of my research, and I think it's a big part of research that many other organizations have done across the country. Bail is such a topic that is talked about right now, and there's a lot of changes going on. So Illinois, for example, is one that I'm sure most of us have heard about, the Pretrial Fairness Act that was passed a couple of years ago and goes into effect in January. New Jersey several years ago did a massive overhaul of their bail and pretrial detention system. New York, New Mexico, California, all of those places have seen shifts in their bail laws and practices. And that is definitely something that those of us involved in this work are looking at as examples, as places to learn from as we're moving forward. Thinking about what bail could look like or what pretrial practices could look like in Minnesota. And thank you, Linda. Linda dropped in the chat the link to a bill that has been introduced a few times in the Minnesota legislature to limit the use of money bail for misdemeanors. That has previously not advanced much when it's been introduced, but it is a reform that has been considered. And one of the reasons that MNJRC, ACLU, MFF, Legal Rights Center are pursuing this data is that one of the reasons that this bill hasn't progressed is because a lot of legislators look at it and say, well, how do we know there's a problem? Where's the data to show us that there's a problem? And so we're hoping that by pulling together both the qualitative data that MNJRC is compiling from community members and the quantitative data that we can cull from the state, that we can begin to tell a story to legislators about why pretrial reform matters here. Adoniyah, there's a question here that I think you'll be able to answer. Does MFF receive back the amount they paid for bail in the same manner that an individual would, as referenced if it is paid in full in cash?
Well, I can answer that first question. The first question, does MFF receive back the amount they paid for bail in the same manner that an individual would, as referenced if it is paid in full in cash? MFS receives every cent that we use to post bail for a client. Unlike the bond, the bond is a thing where a percentage is paid up front that is not given back to the client. It is kept by the bail bondsman, and then some other court fees and things of that nature could be taken out yeah, some court fees and things could be taken out, some of that nature. It depends on which county you're in or whatever. But yes, Minnesota Freedom Fund receives everything. It is recycled for us. We use the same funds in its recycling. It's currency. So that's what we do. We use it as it intended at its intended purpose, currency. Yes. The second question would have to be answered with someone who has a little bit more knowledge on that subject.
The second question from this person is, has there been any backtracking done to understand the why behind the significant jump in cash bail since the 70s? The answer is yes. There's a lot of research on the history of cash bail and how it's been used. I think the easiest answer, and for the sake of time, the fastest one, is to say that the same reason that every other criminal legal issue has ballooned since the 70s is the same reason cash bail has. A fear of dangerousness, a backlash to the civil rights movement, the war on drugs. All of those are reasons why an increase in cash bail has happened. It's really the punitive carceral state coming to bear on this issue as many others. It looks like we are out of time. We are getting some really great questions in the chat. Marci, did you want to respond really quickly to Michael's question to close us out? Michael says, a recent candidate for Hennepin County Attorney indicated that judges such as herself purposely set bail so high that they expect the accused person to be stuck in jail. Is that constitutional, and does that violate professional code of conduct for Minnesota judges?
So I can answer this because I did all of our system actor interviews. So at least from those 14 people and talking to those 14 people, the only constitutional piece is that people just have a right to bail, but there's a bail schedule, right? So judges can look at that and it gives recommendations based on the charge and the evidence. And then the prosecutor asks for a certain amount of bail. And then the public defender says no for these reasons, but several of the system actors did admit that they know of judges, or have literally heard judges and prosecutors say, well, MFF might be able to pay this bail. I'm not kidding. And so they're like, well, we're going to set it too high for them. So just as one example. And so I would not be surprised if that was happening in other cases as well. And unfortunately, no is not unconstitutional, because they can give several different reasons and might argue that the prosecutor was, convincing enough with their purposes of why the bail should be so high, and etc. So whether or not the person's release is kind of the priority. Yes. So that's a very succinct, but unfortunately it's allowed.
I will just jump in from a legal perspective. It is common, but I would argue it is unconstitutional. There are requirements for how a judge consider, and it violates the rules of criminal procedure at the very least. Whether that, I agree with Marci, it's really hard to litigate because a judge doesn't have to. They can say whatever they want to say about why they assigned a particular bail. That doesn't mean that it's legal. And so constitutional challenges would be difficult, but it is, our Constitution has the right to bail, and it has a right to a fair bail. So I would argue it's not a constitutional practice. And we're a couple minutes over time, so I think I'm going to wrap us up. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who engaged in the chat, everyone who attended. If you have further questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm sorry I don't have a slide with our contact information, but I will drop at least my email in the chat, and please feel free to reach out in the future. Enjoy the rest of the sessions.